Hello, everyone. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook, continuing our series in modern American history. That is U.S. history since 1877. We're now up to around 1900 with the emerging American Empire. And I think in the last session we got up to the Spanish-American War, particularly in Cuba. Let me go to my slides here. This is a political cartoon, 1914, showing the Spanish colonies before intervention by the United States. And the top there, they look pretty helpless. Spanish oppression. And then down below, you see them dressed in business attire. In one case, smoking a cigar. Two cases, looking polished. The differences are obvious and exaggerated, with the top figures described as oppressed by the weight of industrial slavery until the United States rescued them, turning them into respectable and successful businessmen, seen on the bottom half. This was claimed as a justification for American imperialism, which brought civilization and prosperity to destitute peoples. And they use visuals like this to support their cause. And here now is a Filipino patriot and hero, Emilio Aguinaldo. At the start of the War with Spain, U.S. military leaders brought the Filipino patriot Emilio Aguinaldo back from Singapore because they thought he would stir up a popular uprising that would help defeat the Spaniards. Aguinaldo came back because he thought the Americans favored an independent Philippines. Oops. Mutual misunderstandings. These differing intentions were the root cause of the Filipino insurrection that proved far costlier in American and Filipino lives than the war with Spain that preceded it. It was also some of the first atrocities committed by U.S. troops were committed in the Filipino War. Here is a map showing the route that Commodore Dewey took from Hong Kong to Manila in 1898, May 1st. He actually arrived almost before any fighting began in Cuba with the Rough Riders because, as I told you in a previous video, that Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he immediately telegraphed or cabled to Commodore Dewey to take Manila Harbor. And so you see in the insert in the lower left, he sailed into Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, sank the Spanish fleet and took Manila Bay, thereby acquiring for the United States a colony near China and a potential naval station for global U.S. power. So fighting broke out in February 4th, 1899, between American and Filipino patrols on the edge of Manila. The rebel leader Aguinaldo turned his guns on the American occupiers. The conflict was far worse than the war with Spain, which had been commonplace atrocities on both sides. That is, in the Philippines, 4,200 Americans died and many thousands of Filipinos. The fighting finally ended in 1902. 1900, William McKinley's re-election over William Jennings Bryan indicated that most Americans approved of the overseas adventure. William Jennings Bryan, by the way, was a populist candidate. This was possibly the high watermark of populism in the United States. In 1901, the Supreme Court asserted that the Constitution did not automatically extend citizenship to the acquired territories. Thank you, Supreme Court. Whether the inhabitants would be granted citizenships would be up to Congress. The U.S. was now clearly a colonial power. It's another cartoon President McKinley is measuring an obese Uncle Sam for larger clothing, while the anti-expansionists, like journalist Joseph Pulitzer, unsuccessfully offer him a weight loss elixir. As the nation increased its imperialistic presence and mission, many worried that America would grow too big for its own good. Here, this is an 1899 cartoon or picture of Theodore Roosevelt leading the charge of the Rough Riders of San Juan Hill, legend during this operation, which then positioned him to be tapped as President William McKinley's running mate for vice president in the next presidential election, I think, which was the following year. Fortune smiled upon Theodore Roosevelt. And this is a picture of Tom Berenger playing the role of Theodore Roosevelt in the made-for-TV movie Rough Riders. You can get some extra credit if you want to watch it and write out a discussion about it, especially the second half. The first half shows the recruiting and training of the soldiers. The second half shows the actual fighting. Notice this was the scene I was talking to you about in the previous episode that I think is the one message that comes clearly through in this movie with Tom Berenger. And this is immediately after he gets to the top of San Juan Hill. He's kind of feeling emotionally overwhelmed by the close experience of being in battle. And he sits down, and some soldiers come up and begin to raise an American flag behind him. And you see there a water tower behind the flag, and it says Empire on it. And the flag is flapping over the Empire, and a black soldier comes up and speaks to Colonel Roosevelt, saying, "It's okay, Colonel, we won, we're okay." And Colonel Theodore Roosevelt turns to him and said, "Everything has changed." And so this picture symbolizes the pivotal moments, I suppose, the storming of San Juan Hill and the victory of the Spanish-American War, in which the United States crosses from the 19th century into the 20th century on its way to becoming the dominant global world power. So that's the picture from, I don't remember the minutes, but it's near the end of the movie. So, another presidential race. McKinley is re-elected president of the United States. His VP is Theodore Roosevelt. And then in September, McKinley was assassinated. And Theodore Roosevelt became the president of the United States at age 42. I believe he was the youngest man to ever become president. John Kennedy comes close. I think John Kennedy may have been 43. And Theodore Roosevelt was ready to take charge. He had no doubts about America's role in the world, and he had read Thomas Mahon's book, The Role of Sea Power in History, and he knew what the United States needed to do. So here you see a graphic map of the Caribbean. The blue areas, or the greenish blue, are United States possessions. You see Puerto Rico is included in that. And U.S. interventions. There was U.S. interventions in Mexico, in Nicaragua, in Panama, in Venezuela, and the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, and in Cuba. This was just from about 1895 up through 1824. So quite a lot of intervention going on here as the United States stretched its imperial muscles, especially in its backyard in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here's a picture of Japan and China and it shows spheres of influence and colonial possessions. Japan doesn't appears to be its own color, and you see the British, French, Japanese, Russian, German all have spheres of influence, particularly in China. Also, you see the French are in French Indochina. Manila is a colonial possession of the United States. So this is the if you remember, I said that the imperial era began with 1884 with a conference in Berlin that carved up Africa for European spheres of influence, but now you see the same thing being extended to Asia. This cartoon demonstrates nativist sentiment in 1882, where you see white Uncle Sam with the goatee holding his head and being shocked and dismayed by these unruly and ruffians who represent, if you look on the bottom there, you see some of the names. I can barely see it. Germans, Irishmen, can't read the second one there. But these are basically European immigrants. Russians sleeping up above, Negroes, it says, Frenchmen, and so there's distress among nativists. Nativists are people that are suspicious or xenophobic, suspicious of outsiders coming into the country to provide labor when there's a labor shortage. And that often happens when there is a labor shortage, you get higher numbers. And here's a cartoon called The Melting Pot. The idea of America as a melting pot, a common metaphor, is a way of arguing for ethnic assimilation of all immigrants into a nebulous American identity. This was at the turn of the 20th century. A play of the same name premiered in 1908 to great acclaim. Let me back up for a moment to this frame. I was talking about Theodore Roosevelt. I want to point out that his big stick, his saying was, speak softly and carry a big stick, but for Roosevelt, the big stick was naval power. And I talked earlier about the various options for a transatlantic canal from the Caribbean over to the Pacific. There was one, a strip of land in Mexico just above the Yucatan Peninsula. Nicaragua and Panama were the three options. The French company that was building the Panama Canal went belly up. They were the same ones, by the way, that had built the what's the name of the canal that runs through Egypt? The Suez Canal. So they had done that successfully, but they were unable to do it in Panama. After they went belly up, Roosevelt leased a strip of land across Panama to try to continue the efforts of the French. But Panama was a province of Colombia, so in order to get this lease approved, the Colombian legislature had to approve it. And Colombia had just come through a 3-year civil war that was rather brutal, and they were not in the mood to share access to Panama with the United States, so they turned down the offer. Maybe that they were bargaining for a better deal. Roosevelt was furious when the Colombian legislature rejected the treaty and considered seizing Panama. But instead, he decided to take a covert approach and encourage and assist some of the Panamanian independence-minded people. So they were able to encourage them and help them bring off a bloodless coup. The Constitution of Panama was copied from the Cuban Constitution. The flag was designed and made in New York by a U.S. citizen. The United States stationed several warships off the coast of Panama to stop the Colombian Navy from landing troops there. And in 1903, the U.S. recognized Panama. 2 weeks later, it obtained the renewable lease from the new country of Panama for the canal zone. And it must be said that building the canal was one of the heroic engineering feats of the century. It took 8 years of digging by thousands of hired laborers. Many of them were Afro-Caribbeans from the various islands of the Caribbean. He dug for 8 years to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to finish the huge project. 240 million cubic yards of earth were moved. In 1919, the Panama Canal opened and gave the U.S. a commanding position in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the Caribbean front door. The Secretary of State at the time, Elihu Root, said that the countries of the Caribbean, that Central America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, had been placed in the front door of the U.S., therefore they must behave themselves. An ominous note there. In 1902, the U.S. reorganized Cuban finances and carried out a program to eliminate yellow fever. Cuba accepted the Platt Amendment as a condition of the U.S. leaving and turning over their affairs back to Cubans. The Platt Amendment said that if there was any hint of instability or violence, the U.S. reserved the right to immediately intervene in Cuba once again. And the United States also demanded and got a 99-year lease on the eastern tip of Cuba, a place called Guantanamo, the famous Guantanamo base. First time the Cuban legislature voted, they were voted against the Platt Amendment, and so basically the United States held a gun to their head and forced them to pass it by one vote. Roosevelt announced in 1904 that the United States would act as the policeman of the region. This was the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, I can't pronounce that word, Corollary, to the Monroe Doctrine, which transformed the broad principle against European interference in Latin America to an unrestricted right to regulate Caribbean affairs. The Roosevelt Corollary was not a treaty, but a unilateral declaration of American power. So now you see the American empire beginning to assert its dominance. So let's talk about Asia for a moment. I believe maybe I have, let's see if I have a map. I don't know if I do. Yeah, here it is. This is the map of Asia. Commercial interests dominated American policy. There was a desire to find new markets to sell stuff to in East Asia, particularly China. And so I have already mentioned Japan, Russia, Germany, France, and Britain all carved out spheres of influence in China, which I'm sure China, got a sarcastic statement can I make? I'm sure it didn't go over well with China. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay sent them an open door note demanding the right of equal trade access to business in China. So this open door policy was intended to prevent Japan and the European powers from shutting the United States out of China. Of course, that's one of the big reasons for the Spanish-American War, was to obtain a military base in the Philippines in order to have access to China. When a secret society of Chinese nationalists, the Boxers, the famous Boxer Rebellion, rose up against foreigners in 1900, the United States sent 5,000 troops and to join the multinational campaign to break the power of the Boxer Rebellion in Beijing. Britain, Germany, France, and Russia were strongly entrenched in East Asia and not inclined to defer to American interests. Also, the U.S. faced a powerful Asian competitor, that is, Japan, which had its own vital interests. Although the open door policy was important, Roosevelt recognized higher stakes in the Pacific. So let's talk a moment about Japan. Let me see how I'm doing on my time. Japan had unveiled its military strength in 1894 in the war against China. It had modernized very, very rapidly, kind of an amazing transformation of Japan into a modern, almost a modern European state or developed state. A decade later, provoked by the Russian rivalry in Manchuria, Japan attacked the Tsar's fleet at Port Arthur in China and won a brilliant victory over the Russians. Japan emerged as a dominant power in East Asia. So, between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. This migration was a process that began before the Civil War, but by the 20th century, the new groups such as Italians, Polish, Eastern Europeans, Jews, made up a larger percentage of arrivals than the earlier Irish and Germans. This takes us to the picture I showed before. There, yeah. So this large-scale immigration began to stir up a lot of nativist sentiment and fear. Native residents. And this takes us to the Pancho Villa episode, one of my favorite stories in American history. Pancho Villa was one of the generals of the Mexican Revolution, allied with Emiliano Zapata. Eventually, the Mexican Revolution deteriorated into a civil war among the various revolutionary groups, and Pancho Villa thought the United States was on his side. He at one point, one of the ambassadors said that he would make a great president of Mexico and would be friendly to American interests. Well, the U.S. basically betrayed Pancho Villa and decided to throw its weight behind Venustiano Carranza. And they began to back him. He was from the wealthier elites. They thought he'd be better for U.S. business than Pancho Villa, who was basically a blue-collar peasant bandit who rose, because of his military brilliance, rose to the rank of general. And they began to supply Carranza with weapons and assistance and support, which then infuriated Pancho Villa, who invaded Arizona. I'm trying to remember the name of the town. I can't remember the name at the moment. They invaded a small town on the border with Mexico and killed a number of residents as an act of revenge against the United States, which then led President Wilson to send troops into the United States under the command of our old friend Major Blackjack Pershing, who now is a general in the U.S. Army. And so Pershing invaded Mexico with 120,000 troops, the first expeditionary force of U.S. history to use mechanized warfare and to travel with trucks rather than on horseback. Wilson was an idealist. President Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1914, he was a Democrat and he was a liberal idealist. I'm using liberal in the foreign policy sense of the word. And he intended to foster constitutional liberty in the world. He promised that the U.S. would never again seek additional territory by conquest, overlooking the fact that he invaded Mexico with 120,000 soldiers just to capture one man, Pancho Villa. He was committed to advancing human rights, national integrity, and opportunity abroad. But he was a racist from Georgia, a Southern Democrat. A lot of contradictions in this time period. We'll talk some more next time about the progressive movement. But sometimes the progressive movement was not so progressive. And in the case of Woodrow Wilson, he supported all these human rights, ideals, national integrity, right to self-determination, but he was fiercely racist and wanted to eliminate the integration in the civil service. So he's a contradiction in terms. Mexico became a primary object in Wilson's foreign policy. Revolution broke out in 1911. I've already talked about that. Francisco Maduro overthrew the dictator Porfirio Diaz. Maduro spoke about liberty and constitutionalism as much as Wilson, but was deposed and assassinated when the ambassador from the United States suggested to one of the generals, General Huerta, Victoriana Huerta, that the United States would smile and look favorably upon a Huerta administration if they were to remove Francisco Madero. I don't think they intended that Victoriana Huerta shoot Madero, but that's in fact what happened. Huerta pulled the president of Mexico, Maduro, and the vice president, and had them shot against a wall, and assumed the presidency himself with the encouragement of the U.S. ambassador. President Wilson was shocked and appalled and abhorred Huerta, calling him a murderer, and was determined to force him out. Obviously, the Henry Layton Wilson, the ambassador, no relationship to President Wilson, was fired or unceremoniously removed from his post. President Wilson went against big businesses which wanted to support Huerta. There you go, big business. Keep that in mind in American history. In order to put Mexico back on the path of constitutionalism. So President Woodrow Wilson meant well here. He went against big business and attempted to uphold constitutionalism despite their own ambassador betraying them. Venustiano Carranza rose against Huerta, but was also anti-U.S. He was a nationalist. There's a lot of detail here. I probably should some of it. So, at any rate, Pancho Villa invaded Columbus, New Mexico. He killed 16 American civilians. There's a great documentary about this done by PBS, This American Life, about the invasion of U.S. troops into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. If you find it, it's well worth watching. Wilson sent the troops. I'm sorry, I must correct myself. This says 11,000 troops. I thought it was 120,000, but perhaps I'm mistaken. So this brought Mexico and the United States to the brink of war, not surprisingly. In 1916 and 17. I'm going to wrap this up. Just give me a moment. So, we have American troops driving down through the northern part of Mexico, attempting to capture Pancho Villa. President Wilson is on the verge of declaring war against Mexico. He has a declaration and an appeal to Congress to declare war written out, and he's getting ready to sign it, and he decides to sleep on it, and he goes to bed. He doesn't sign it, and then within a short time, events change in Europe. I think the Lusitania was sunk, and suddenly the United States is now at war in Europe against the Axis, or the Germans. He had to unceremoniously withdraw the U.S. troops out of Mexico, and Mexicans are writing rancheros. These are country ballads, praising Pancho Villa and mocking the United States. General Pershing wrote a very dispirited letter to his father-in-law about feeling like they were leaving with their tail between the legs. But within a few months, he was leading the American Expeditionary Forces over to Europe to fight in Europe. And the Spanish flu was taking a toll on U.S. society. So that concludes our brief examination of the beginnings of the American Empire. Next week, we'll discuss the Progressive Era. Thank you very much. Take care.